Welcome everybody. I will talk today about motor attraction and non-targets in visual search. And yesterday we already heard a lot about attention and visual search in Ralph Lieben's talk. So today we will look at the motor side of visual search, specifically what effects attention can have on motor output. So I will start with explaining our motivation for probing the motor side of visual search. Then I will give you a bit of background on attention and motor control. We conducted two visual search experiments with mouse tracking and eye tracking, and I will explain those to you. And then I will conclude what we found. And if you have questions anytime during the talk, just interrupt me. So our motivation. In many search tasks in real life, it's not just finding a target that is your goal, but you also want to reach for it. And in traditional theories, it was assumed that motor control and cognitive function are separated. But there is now vast evidence that suggests that motor and cognitive functions are actually deeply connected. We know of studies by Song and Nakayama, for example, that show that cognition, movement planning, and execution all happen in parallel. And there are studies that show that the brain areas involved in motor control and in higher cognitive functions are tightly correlated. So we can therefore use methods like mouse tracking and eye tracking and all kinds of behavioral methods and gain insight from those into cognitive processes that are working at the time. And this is exactly what we're going to do. One example for this is actually the detection of covered attention shifts, which I will talk about later. And this already brings me to attention and motor control. So you remember, hopefully from yesterday's talk, that there are many different theories about motor control, about attention. But we know from Wolf, for example, that there is a guided theory that's very dominant of search, which we assume there is a pre-attentive stage where some guiding features are processed first in parallel, and then the attention will select the targets in the second stage. And color and orientation are supposed to be guiding features here. I'm sorry, I have written. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So we also know that there are task-relevant features that will influence search efficiency. And we know that some of these attentional processes will actually change hand trajectories, so we know that attention does have an effect on our motor output. We also know that pointing trajectories are biased according to the spatial distributions of potential target locations, and that shorter planning intervals lead to movement into a default direction between the potential targets. But those are both pointing tasks where there are no attentional or visual search processes involved. So these examples are not for tasks that involve highly cognitive functions. And what we are interested in is, would we find the same effects where attention changes the hand trajectories in a visual search task? So let's start with the first experiment. What we were interested in was seeing whether target could attract a mouse trajectory in this visual search task. So this is a conjunction search task, and we have seen with different bars of colors and orientations. If you remember, those are features that are supposed to guide attention. And we have one target element here. This is an example for the color condition. And the target element has 9 possible target locations where they can pop up. And then we have these distractor elements that will share either the color or the orientation of the target, and they can pop up at those possible distractor locations that are shown here in blue and red. And all around this, we have a lot of filler items that will just make the task a little more different. The task itself works like this. You are first presented your target item for 1 second, then you hear a beep and you have to start moving upwards. When you have surpassed a certain threshold, the scene will pop up, and you then have to find and click on the target. Now what we can do is separate our possible distractor locations according to which side on the target they lie on. So we would draw an imaginary line from the start position down here to the target location. You can see that here. And then we can separate our distractor elements, depending on whether they lie on the left or on the right side of the target. And we would assume then that the distractor, if he induces an attentional shift, would attract the mouse trajectory either to the left or to the right. So we take all trajectories over all possible target and locations and distractor locations. For each distractor and target location, we test all combinations, and then we have a whole lot of trajectories, and then we throw them all together and take the mean over these trajectories. So let's look at the results. If we take the mean trajectories over all conditions and all target positions, and then separate them for distractors that lie to the left of the direct path or to the right of the direct path, we can plot them, normalize them over time. So the movement time is here on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you have the deviation from the direct path. And then we would compute Cohen's absolute difference score. So that's the deviation from the direct path for both trajectories. And as you can see here, we have a significant effect of the distractor side in the second half of the movement. That's overall conditions. If we then look at the 2 different conditions, we see that we have this distractor effect in the color condition too, but there is no effect in orientation. This is again visible if we just look at the effect of the condition. So in blue here you have the orientation, and that is pretty much just a straight line, and in color you have the deviation, so you have a significant effect there too. But that makes sense. If we have a distractor effect in color and no effect in orientation, obviously we would have an effect here too. So what we did next was we tested for bimodality in our trajectory populations, because we wanted to make sure whether or not our effect was actually just an artifact of some very highly curved deviating trajectories and other trajectories that are pretty much straight. So we calculated the maximal curvature and then tested for bimodality. And as we can see here, we have a population that is pretty much unimodal. So we can conclude that our trajectories actually all belong to one population, and that's a good thing. So the effect does not come from some highly curved trajectories and some very straight trajectories. What we also did was investigate whether the distance from distractor and target played a role. So we calculated the difference score, coincidence score for the different distances from distractor to target. And it looks here like as if the effect would get bigger with a higher distance from target to distractor. But you can see that we have an outlier here. All the other points are pretty much at 500 millimeters. So those are the 4 distractors that are very near to the target. And if we remove this outlier, we actually see that the regression is very low. So we conclude from that the distractor effect is actually pretty stable over distance. This is important for our second experiment, to which I will come now. But first, let me summarize the results of our experiment. So we saw that distractor with the same color as the target attracts the mouse trajectory, but the same is not the case if the distractor has the same orientation. And we also know that our trajectory population is not bimodal, so our effect is real for our trajectories. And the effect is also independent of the distance from distractor to target, which is a good thing. Now, in our second experiment, we additionally also did eye tracking. The motivation for that was that we wanted to know where participants looked during the experiment, so that we could infer whether the effect of the mouse trajectory would just be due to participants following with the hand to where they were looking, or whether a covered attentional shift could also be responsible for the attraction. So overt search, just a short reminder, means that you would conduct a series of eye movements to bring a complex item onto the fovea, and covert search happens if an item is actually large enough to be identified without fixation. So this one cannot be directly observed, but has to be inferred rather from other behavioral data. And that's what we are hoping to achieve. So the second experiment is very similar to our first experiment. We again have a visual search task where we are presented with a target element. We have again a distractor element and lots of filler elements. The biggest difference is that we also did eye tracking. I just explained why. And we also wanted to boost the orientation effect because we didn't find that in the first experiment. And we're assuming that it should be there too, because orientation is, according to many studies, a guiding feature. So we made our items a lot thinner and used cardinal orientations, which are easier to perceive, and hope that that would boost our effect. We also discarded some distractor positions. Now we only have 16. We did that mainly for practical reasons, because the eye tracking device actually gets pretty heavy, and we didn't want to torment our participants much. The good thing is that we know from our first experiments that we can discard these positions because the effect is stable for different distances from distractor to target. So let's have a look at the results. First, the mean trajectories again. We see again on the color condition here that we have an effect for this for sight in the color condition. We said we do not have an effect in orientation. We also this time introduced a condition where the distractor would share no feature with the target, so this would be a baseline condition, and it's not surprising that we do not have an effect here. But we also have no effect for orientation, so boosting orientation apparently did not work. We think we know why, and I will come to this later. But first, we again did our sanity checks to see whether our trajectories all belong to the same population. And again, we saw the curvature was not bimodal, and we also had to look at the speed for different groups if they looked at the target or at the distractor, and we also saw that those were all more or less bell-shaped, so that all seems that the trajectories belong to the same population, and even between distractor looked at and not looked at, there are no differences. So now we can use eye tracking to further investigate what is happening in the color condition where we have our significance. So first, we wanted to see if participants even looked at interesting points of interest. That would be the start of the movement, the start position, the target position, and the distractor position. And what we found here that in all conditions, the start and the target were fixated most of the time. You see here 80% almost in all conditions in all trials for the target and 60% for the start. But the distractor was rarely fixated, and only in the color condition, but there too it's about 20% of all the trials in the color condition where the distractor was fixated. If you have a look here at the distribution of the fixations, you see that participants fixated mostly at the start, at the target, and just in the middle of the scene. And then they made some fixations along the mouse trajectory. So we know that participants looked at points of interest and rarely fixated the distractor. If we now have a look at the mean trajectories for color, we see that we have our effect in color. And if we then group the trajectories for cases where the distractor was looked at and where the distractor was not looked at, we also see that for both cases, we have a significant effect. The effect is higher for cases where the distractor was actually fixated, but in the second half of the movement, it is also there where the distractor was not fixated. So we can infer from this data that we have a covered attentional shift that would achieve this attraction to the target. We also see that looking in itself, so in the comparison of just was the distractor fixated or not, there is no significant difference between the targets, so it's just a very small one. So the population of trajectories for distractor fixated or not seem also be the same. So to conclude our results, what we found was an attraction effect in mouse trajectories to a task relevant item, but only for the feature color. And we did expect that we would also find one for orientation, but we did not. But that's likely to the fact that color is just a very dominant feature. And there are other studies that found that orientation is actually not dominated by the color in the search task and does not have an effect here. So that's probably why we didn't find our effect for orientation. That does not mean that the orientation effect is not there, just that it's not there in our experiment. It's quite possible that if we were to conduct a different experiment where color as a feature is just absent, and we would combine orientation with a different feature that's not so dominating, we would actually find an effect for orientation. That might be next. So we also see that attraction of the mouse trajectory to the distractor is there even if the distractor is not fixated. So we infer that covert attentional shift happens there, and that in visual search, distractors that are not fixated can still induce these attentional shifts and have an effect on the movement. And with this, I would like to conclude my talk. Thank you all for your attention. And if you have questions, please ask them.